Okay.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another installment of our China lecture series this year. Today, we're going to be talking about China's digital currency rollout plan. And we are very happy to have two distinguished panelists with us today. One is Dr. Marc Lanteigne, who is an associate professor of political science at the Arctic University in Tromsø in Norway. He's an expert on Chinese and East Asian political and international affairs and has published widely on Chinese foreign policy. And our other panelist is Mahima Duggal, who is an associate research fellow here at ISTP and is also an editorial assistant to the Routledge series on Think Asia. So with the Beijing Olympics of 2022 coming up and the Chinese government just posting a policy paper on a civilized internet, I think there's it's quite a moving target, but it's worthwhile to dive into the topic of China's e-currency plans and how this is going to affect all of us potentially, or what it means for all of us. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Marc Lanteigne for a presentation. Just one quick reminder for our audience, please post your questions in the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. So Marc, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you, Larissa. Thank you, everybody. Pleasure to be back. And what I would like to do with this presentation is to discuss a bit of research that I've been conducting over the past few months on the subject of China's very ambitious e-currency policies, not only in terms of how this is going to affect Chinese finance, but also the potential for it to affect Chinese trade, international relations, and even security. So talking historically, China has certainly had a very kind of distinguished past when it comes to being at the forefront of various innovations in currency. It was seen as the first country, first nation to develop a paper currency. That was back during the Song dynasty of the 11th and 12th centuries. And then once you get to the Ming and Qing dynasties, starting after the 16th century, China was at the forefront of the global silver trade. But now what China is trying to do, and this is very interesting from a variety of angles, China's again trying to be at the forefront of a new phase, if you will, of global finance. And that is the rush towards centralized government digital currencies. Now, what China is trying to do is, over the past few years, it has begun experimentations into what is essentially a digital renminbi, a digital version of China's renminbi currency. And this would act as a complement to and eventually a replacement for the actual physical currency, China's fiat currency based on coins and bills. Now, what's been interesting is how this progress has accelerated over a very short time. And I think part of this has to do with the effects of the Sino-American trade war since 2018. And also the fact that China now sees a window of opportunity, especially in light of the fact that many other large economies, including the United States and the European Union, are comparatively far behind in developing this particular technology. So how does one look at what China is doing with its digital currency experimentation? Well, my work looks at this in three different ways. First and foremost, I'm interested in how this is a reactive policy, how China is developing this kind of e-renminbi within a very rapidly changing situation in global finance, as well as the fact that we're now seeing examples of so-called weaponized interdependence, meaning how various economic networks, globalization, have created windows of opportunity for state-to-state influence and at times coercion. And I'll be getting into that a bit later on. The second point is that China's e-currency experiments are also seen as a costly signal to the global community, especially to the United States. Beijing is saying that it is seeking to now challenge Western financial institutions and possibly even the US dollar, although I think that might be a bit premature at this point. And the third area is, how does this affect China's structural power within the international system? How is China able to make use of potential digital currency to increase its power, not only in terms of absolute, not only in terms of making China a more attractive center for financial transactions, but also in relation to the United States. So what are we talking about here? Well, the original plan was for China to develop what has been called a digital currency electronic payment, the DCEP. Now, at the beginning of the year, this has been changed, the title has been changed to the eCNY. So in other words, the digital renminbi or the digital yuan. This has very significant, as I'm going to be arguing, not only domestic, but international level implications. Although I should stress that right now, most of the experimentation is taking place within China itself. So in other words, the Chinese government is insisting that this is an effect for the Chinese domestic economy and not necessarily the international one. Although we are starting to see some very strong signs that China does have international plans for the eCNY. Now, China is not the only country that is doing this. Many countries, I should point out, Sweden, Norway, Britain, the European Union, many countries have started to experiment with the so-called central bank digital currencies. But so far, China's efforts have been the most advanced. Now, I should point out that there are already two organizations that have functional central bank digital currencies. One is the government of Barbados, which has had it in place since last year. And more recently, beginning of this year, 5 other Caribbean countries have set up a system called Dcash, which came online a few months ago. So China's not the first, but it is the biggest and it is the largest country to have their digital currency system well underway. Now, what China's been doing recently is conducting experiments. It has been trying to set up sort of beta or model versions of the eCNY, engaging in a process known as helicopter money. Now, not literally dropping money from helicopters, although I'd like to see that, but rather giving out samples by lottery of small amounts of the currency and asking people, go out and spend it. Go to your grocery store, go to your bookstore and try it out. So there's been multiple experiments in many different cities. At present, about 2 billion yuan, or about 307 million American, has been distributed through these various tests. And so, quite a bit of experimenting going on. One example, this year's New Year's celebrations in Suzhou, various people were chosen by lottery. They were given about 200 yuan of digital currency to go out and spend. That's about $31 American. Some Western companies in Chinese cities like McDonald's and Starbucks have also been set up to take eCNY. And it's also starting to be used for business to business or B2B transactions. So various other cities have been the subject of testing, but far and away, as Larissa noted, the acid test for this currency is going to be the upcoming Olympics early next year in Beijing. That is the expected kind of platform for a mass rollout of the currency. And I should also point out that in addition to just going out and buying things, eCNY holders are now being given the opportunity to buy investment funds, insurance products, all of it online. So where is this coming from? Well, the Xi Jinping government, and we've seen a lot of examples of this just over the past few weeks, trying to take advantage of the fact that Beijing wants to begin to leapfrog many other international actors in being at the forefront of various technologies. So you have the Made in China 2025 project and the more recent China Standards 2035. China wants to take the lead in many kind of cutting edge areas of tech, including artificial intelligence, blockchain, quantum computing. Now, online payments are already very easy to find in China and elsewhere. Everyone's heard of Alipay, everyone's heard of WeChat Pay. So what is the difference between that and the eCNY? Well, the first difference is that the eCNY would be a step further in the sense that it would not be tied to any physical bank and it could be used offline. So China has touted the digital renminbi because it is very easy to use. It is obviously cheaper to use than printing paper currency. It combats counterfeiting. And more to the point, it increases the number of people who are banked. So in other words, have access to a bank account. So Beijing is really trying to play this up as a great step forward in improving finance for more and more people. That said, and going back to the international aspect, Beijing has not been shy about the fact that the eCNY could eventually, probably quite soon, be used to be involved in Chinese trade. There's already been some hints that China would like to introduce it to various strands of the Belt and Road Network. to facilitate trade between members, as well as to build the widely touted digital Silk Road between China and various partners in East Asia, South Asia, and beyond. It's very possible that we're going to start to see the eCNY be used amongst Belt and Road partners, as well as potentially within trade partners in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which was signed on a few months ago. And Beijing has already started talks, just to give an example, with Hong Kong, Thailand, and the United Arab Emirates to create some kind of joint digital currency system. So there is very little doubt that there is an international effect as to what's going on here. Now, it's also important to note that the eCNY could also be a very important aspect of the Xi government to place many areas of fintech, financial technology, under greater central control. And you look at what's been happening since last year and even just over the past few weeks. The Chinese government has cracked down very extensively on several high-tech companies within China. So you look at Alibaba, Didi, Meituan, Tencent. And just over the past week, there was a bit of a stir when it was announced that Alipay would be forcibly broken up by the Chinese government. Now, why is this happening? There are many different reasons behind this, and I'm happy to bring this up in the questions, but I think that one of the rationales is to clear the decks, to, in other words, create space for the digital renminbi to be rolled out and to prevent any kind of internal challenge to it. So the development of, so I'm talking about kind of the active approach to the CNY, but the fact is much of China's digital currency is also reactive in many ways. China is starting to look at what is happening in global finance and is starting to become very concerned about various aspects which could place China out of control, if you will, like not give China the ability to influence many areas of global finance. And I'd say probably the biggest example of this would be the rise, fall, I'm not sure what the prices are looking at, of Bitcoin. By the way, this is not real. I wish this was real because I think Bitcoin is running at about 48,000 American now. So yeah, I wish this was real. But China is very concerned about Bitcoin, not only because of the fact that it is obviously outside of China's control, but it has proven itself to be very volatile, very difficult to predict, subject to speculation. And these are all areas which China does not want to see with its own digital currency. And it's also starting to gain a great deal of international legitimacy, albeit in a very halting manner. Last year, one of the major cantons of Switzerland, Zug, announced that people in that canton could pay their taxes using Bitcoin. And just a very short time ago, the El Salvador government, President Nayib Bukele, announced that Bitcoin would be the legal tender for El Salvador, and that is the first country to do that. And this is seen as either very daring or very reckless, depending on who you talk to. The worry there is that because Bitcoin is completely decentralized and because it operates independently of financial institutions, there is the question of oversight. So President Xi gave a very interesting speech in 2019 on the subject of Bitcoin and its platform blockchain, saying that Bitcoin is simply not suitable for Chinese interests, but blockchain, on the other hand, is considered to be very important for a lot of Chinese technology interests. And the last time I was in Beijing, I went to the Xinhua bookstore, and there were like walls of books talking about blockchain of various types, how you can use it for your business and which sectors can benefit from it. The thing is, though, China is not very happy with the onset of cryptocurrencies. And China also recently began to crack down on Bitcoin mining, which again affected the price. So I should stress that the eCNY is not going to be a cryptocurrency. It is going to be what is called a stable coin. That means that it is going to be tied to a kind of center of value, in this case, the physical Chinese renminbi. Now, the other reaction that you can measure looking at the development of the eCNY is pretty much by moves by the United States to challenge China's financial growth. There's been so much discussion about decoupling the American and Chinese economies to reduce the amount of dependency that the two great powers economies have with each other. And even though the trade war, which was started by the Donald Trump government in the US, has slowed down a bit, it has not gone away. The decoupling process is likely to continue. And one worry that China has is that this competition between China and the United States could spill over more directly into the world of finance. There are already worries that the United States might be in a position to begin to push China out of various Western-dominated financial institutions. And there is some precedent for this. Back in 2012, case in point, the United States pressured the SWIFT system of money transfer to delist various Iranian banks, and that was also attempted in 2018. There was also a lot of discussion after the Crimea crisis, so that's 2014, about pushing Russia out of the SWIFT system. That would be a considerable disadvantage to any country. The SWIFT system is the standard for moving money around internationally. So the worry is that this particular kind of cork has been removed from the bottle, and that if economic relations between China and the US worsen, the US may be in a position to start pushing China out of some of these institutions. So that's what I mean by weaponized interdependence. Like, when globalization theory began to meet its heyday back in the 1990s, everyone was talking about the death of distance and greater economic equality. But the fact is, you look at who controls and who has the ability to develop various financial institutions, and you see a great deal of lopsided power. The result, according to weaponized interdependence theory, is that certain countries, especially the United States, have developed so-called panopticons. They have a major advantage in gaining information, data about other countries' finances. And more to the point, these networks, including SWIFT, create choke points, create areas of pressure that can be manipulated in order to put strain on various states for security and strategic reasons. China, as well as Russia, and I would say other countries like Iran, Ecuador, have started to become very concerned about the ongoing prominence of the US dollar. And what we're looking at now is the question of whether the eCNY could be used to kind of get China out of the influence of the US dollar and US-led financial systems. So China's seeking a hedge. It is also trying to make sure that the renminbi eventually becomes a more global currency, and that is a very tall order right now. I would say about 60% of global transactions are undertaken using the US dollar. The renminbi, I would say 2%, and that's probably being very generous. So the idea of the renminbi displacing the US dollar, I don't think that's going to happen short term. But what China is trying to do is to reduce the amount of vulnerability of the renminbi and of its own financial interests. Now, one other quick point when I talk about reactions. Back in 2018, it was leaked to the media that Facebook was trying to develop its own international digital currency, and at the time it was called the Libra. Now, apparently, once the Chinese government found out about that, it caused a little bit of a panic, because had the Libra, which was later renamed the Diem, had that actually come online as scheduled, it really would have put a very, very large wrench into a lot of China's own digital currency plans. Now, the thing is, though, the Diem still has not been launched. It has undergone all kinds of changes, scaling back, and it is still under a great deal of pressure from the US government out of concerns about antitrust and potential instability. So I don't know when the Diem is actually going to be online. And I would also point out that under the Donald Trump government, any discussion about a US version of an e-dollar was simply not there. It was simply not a priority for the Trump government. The Biden government is starting to take this a bit more seriously, but the fact is China now has a considerable head start, potentially by as much as 10 years. So now we have a little bit of an issue of catch up with the US government if it wants to potentially challenge what China is doing. Now, this is not to say that everything is, I would say, perfect and pristine when it comes to the eCNY. There's a lot about China's digital currency which we don't fully know or understand yet. Now, what do we know? We do know that the system of the eCNY is going to be set one-to-one with an actual renminbi. So in other words, you'll be able to trade 1 yuan for 1 digital yuan. This can be used for online purchases, as well as brick and mortar purchases. And these kind of currency will be stored in very specific digital wallets as an alternative version of bills and coins. Now I'm going to attempt to share screen. Oh, okay. Oh, it's disabled. Okay, no worries. But what I can say is that the e-currency can be stored in digital wallets and simply be treated as an alternative to the paper money. So the eCNY would be using frameworks provided by the People's Republic of China, the People's Bank of China, China's central bank, but it would be operated day to day by Chinese commercial banks. There's also the potential for the eCNY to be used in various international transactions, including via the Belt and Road. The thing is, though, there's still a lot of ambiguity here. First of all, the biggest question that we have is, what about privacy? Because the People's Bank of China is obviously directly connected to the party state, even though the Chinese government has said that users of the eCNY would anticipate a certain amount of privacy, the fact is we don't know, and we don't know to what degree the Chinese government would have an increasing amount of ability to track people's spending using this particular currency. And the fact is, China has been building a social credit system, rating people on their activity, rating people on when they pay their bills, and just being good citizens. And therefore, there is a concern that the eCNY could be used for widespread social manipulation. Now, there's also a certain question as to what degree blockchain is going to be used in the creation of the eCNY. Originally, China said, yes, this is going to be a blockchain-related structure, but then it started to back away a bit and said, no, we're looking at something a little bit more technology neutral. This was going to be something that would be, and I'm quoting here, loosely coupled links, which would include some elements of blockchain, but other technologies as well. And we don't exactly know what other technologies are going to be used. So one gets the feeling that there's still kind of issues being worked out in terms of nuts and bolts. Okay, I'm going to try to share screen just to give you an idea of what the wallet looks like. Okay, so you can see here, this is a kind of mock-up, a sample of what one would get on their phone. So this is a model set up by the China Construction Bank, one of the banks which is commonly used for various eCNY experimentation. So it's a very, very straightforward process. You're able to store eCNY on your phone. This is a digital wallet. It can be used online or offline, and it can be used for purchases online or offline as well. So I just wanted to give a quick look here. All right. Now, where to conclude here? The development of the eCNY really needs to be studied as a two-level phenomenon. It is definitely a response to challenges within China's domestic economy, but also to efforts by Beijing to internationalize the yuan, to make the renminbi an international standard, and to really have it be accepted by many more countries as a reserve currency, without having to engage in currency liberalization, I should point out. So it really should be looked at through the lens of China's interest in developing structural power in the financial realm, as well as China's interests, as with other areas of technology like AI and quantum computing, to potentially leapfrog the US in areas of emerging technologies. The eCNY is also very much a costly signal. It is a very loud signal, one which is certainly galvanizing the US, and it's certainly galvanizing other countries, including in Europe, saying that Beijing is quite serious about, first of all, developing this technology, and second of all, the fact that China will not be marginalized in the growing digital economy, the growing post-pandemic economy, and the overall kind of very fast-growing world of digital commerce. Beijing is also prepared for, or trying to get itself prepared by a US-led backlash against these various policies. But finally, the eCNY really needs to factor into the wider kind of emerging competition between Beijing and Washington over global economic power. The desire by China to avoid future examples of weaponized interdependence by the US government. And as I said, the cork is out of that particular bottle now. It is going to be very difficult for the US and potentially other countries to kind of restrain the opportunity to use various advantages in financial networks to restrain various countries, as the example of Iran has shown. The other point that I'm wondering about, though, is will this give China, even if the eCNY has a very bumpy rollout, even if we don't see a fully operational eCurrency for, let's say, 5 years or longer, there's still the question of whether China's first mover advantage will allow the eCNY to become a standard where other digital currencies will need to follow. And even if that is the only major advantage of what China is doing, that still puts Beijing in a very, very significant position. Also, if we do see a continuation of the Sino-US decoupling process, and we're seeing multiple signs of this, just look at what was announced recently between the United States, UK, and Australia. They're setting up now greater security cooperation. If this decoupling process continues, China will be under even more pressure to create a financial system which can be shielded from various forms of US and international pressure. And last point, as China continues to develop its so-called dual circulation economy, in other words, creating a great deal of domestic demand growth, medium and small businesses, but also trying to improve international trade. The Belt and Road is still being constructed on various fronts. The idea of economic interdependence is going to be very key to a lot of China's thinking. And the fact that China is also going to be very concerned about protecting its domestic economy from outside pressure. The eCNY is really shaping itself up to be essential to a lot of Beijing's overall areas of financial expansion and the idea of making the renminbi a far more prominent global standard. Okay, thanks. I'll leave it here.
Okay, thank you so much, Marc, for this very enlightening presentation. I think there's still so much to cover in the coming months, and it's still a moving target. So I think we're going to see more and more news coverage coming out. I would like to give the floor to Mahima now. So I will stop here.
Good morning. First of all, let me just thank Larissa and ISDP for inviting me to speak today. And my compliments to Marc for an excellent, really impressive paper. I had the opportunity to go through it. And your article has really gone into the crux of the matter and presented, a comprehensive examination of not only the motivations that have driven China's ECNY development, but also the potential implications of the currency. So I really want to thank you for making my job as a discussant much more enjoyable and easy. And having worked on this topic before, I know it's very difficult to find credible information about the technical nuances, the structural nuances of the e-currency. I mean, we still don't know how it is going to be rolled out on a nationwide scale, because that is a massive undertaking, and how it will integrate with the domestic markets. There's a huge question mark. The legal framework is still developing, and there's not much out there on this. So I was really interested in how you expanded on this part of the topic and how you have scrutinized what Chinese scholars and government experts are writing about the digital yuan to glean crucial insights into how a nationwide rollout of a fully functional state-sponsored cryptocurrency could generate immense political and economic benefits for Beijing. I think 2021 was really a pivotal year for the CCP for two things. I mean, first of all, it marked the onset of Beijing's 14th five-year plan, which was released in March 21 at the Two Sessions annual meeting. And second, of course, was the CCP's centennial celebrations in July. And in both these events, there has been a very clear and a very prominent focus on creating a digital China. For instance, in his report to the National People's Congress in March, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang, he talked about building a digital ecosystem through, and actually I'll quote here, innovation-driven development, and a digital yuan, or eCNY, that integrates the digital and physical economies. So, the very mention of a digital currency at these platforms, in these, landmark speeches shows how prominently the matter features in Chinese strategic planning at this point. Also, as Marc very rightly identified, the US-China trade war and the COVID-19 pandemic have been critical factors which have really pushed the digital yuan program. Despite the pandemic's assault on human health and the global economy. It has been very devastating, but it has also been sort of an enabling story when it comes to the tech industry. The need created by COVID-19 has provided an ideal, thriving environment, which has really allowed a massive scaling of tech innovation. I mean, I heard some experts talk about how, you know, the pandemic had allowed 10 years worth of digital innovation to occur within a span of few months. And you can see this happening all across the tech industry, not just with the cryptocurrencies. So by the beginning of January 2020, just to, you know, put this scaling in context of the Chinese currency, Chinese digital currency, by the beginning of January 2020, the People's Bank of China had filed 84 patent applications related to the DCEP. And as of May 2020, this number grew to over 120. So you can see within just a few months, there has been, you know, a steep acceleration of the program. DCEP was then soft launched in April 2020 in 4 major cities. And by August, trials were expanded to several other cities, including Hong Kong. Alongside this, there was also the launch of the DCEP soft wallet. And in the legal side too, you know, Beijing has begun to put in place a framework for its eCNY. So not only was digital currency mentioned in an official government document, it was a Chinese Supreme Court document for the very first time in July 2020, which provided, you know, a legal basis for the currency, a legal protection of sorts. But Beijing also published a draft law in October last year, which, you know, gave some limited insight into how a legal framework could work, although there was a lack of clarity about, you know, how it may actually come about in practice. At the same time, by the end of last year, there were trials and airdrop lotteries, or helicopter money, as Marc said, and these, you know, airdrops and trials have continued to expand through 2021 with the joint venture between SWIFT payment system and the People's Bank of China being a major development. So even though the impetus on developing an eCNY has become louder, or at least more apparent in the last couple of years, China has in fact been working on the digital currency project for far longer. It was one of the first countries in the world to really, you know, examine cryptocurrencies and seriously consider their potential. China first started looking at cryptocurrencies back in 2014, and this was just an year after Xi Jinping took office. The People's Bank of China set up a research team which was dedicated to exploring the practicality and the feasibility of developing a CBDC, or central bank digital currency. And by January 2016, just 2 years later, it had formally set a goal to develop a national cryptocurrency. For this purpose, it also established a digital currency research institute under the PBOC, which was responsible for all research and development to realize this goal. So it has definitely been far ahead of other Western countries who are, you know, most of them are still at the research and development stage, or, you know, they are just beginning to experiment with it. The industrialized economies, at least. At the same time, there has also been a massive drive to develop and adopt emerging tech solutions, especially blockchain. Blockchain has been highlighted as one of the more important ones in other sectors as well, including agriculture, education, and so many others. So, you know, China is looking at blockchain as part of its developing as part of its national development, you know, to reach its two goals, the next centennial goal, which is due in 2049. So, you know, there's this larger picture to how it is integrating blockchain with its development goals. So over the following 2 to 3 years, 2017, 18, 19, Beijing has carried out somewhat of a crackdown on cryptocurrencies, especially Bitcoin and as well as other altcoins. So, it has forcibly shut down cryptocurrency clearing houses. It has banned initial coin offerings, which is like startup funding, sort of. And crypto asset trading has been banned as well. And simultaneously in 2017, the People's Bank of China, they launched a research project to, develop its DCEP system. So this has really gone hand in hand, it has tried to sort of stifle all competition, and it's wary of the volatility of the cryptocurrencies and trying to promote its own stable coin. So the DCEP was formally announced only in 2019, that is 5 years after research on the cryptocurrency, on the stable coin started. And very interestingly, it was framed at its announcement as a safeguard against the United States' dominant financial and political sway over the SWIFT cross-border payment system. So the announcement, it came in the midst of a very heated trade war. And as Marc also, very astutely assessed in his presentation, China's decision can be really well understood through the concept of weaponized interdependence. I won't go into the particularities and, the definitions of the concept here. I mean, Marc has really well articulated how the theory can be used as a lens to understand China's vision for the eCNY and how it views the digital currency as a means to gain a more coercive power in global finance, or at least more power to resist any potential future attempts by the US to employ sanctions and use its own dominant control of the international monetary system to curtail China's economic power. But I do want to point out that such a framing of the eCNY as a tool against weaponized trade falls very much within China's status or its narrative as a revisionist power. China has long criticized the American-built international monetary system, international financial system that has fostered the dollar's dominance. It has consistently looked to change the status quo, for instance, by talking about and looking to remake Bretton Woods institutions and employ its own brand of institutional statecraft in a way to establish new bodies like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, to compete with Western institutions. And even as China has worked within the system to become a leading and very well integrated economic power today, the trade war with the US, talks of decoupling, such a narrative does have Beijing concerned about Washington's continued hold over the system and the constraints that this could pose. So the digital yuan is China's way to provide itself, to give itself an edge in the economic and technological competition, and really allow Beijing to challenge the primacy of the US dollar. Though, yeah, this might be more of a long-term aim, looking at where the situation is at present. So, talking about motivations, I think I could probably classify the CCP's motivations in launching the DCEP as twofold. First of all, it's to build a robust cashless Chinese economy that allows or that follows China's socialist market economy and combines capitalism with socialist characteristics. So, it is continuously trying to push this agenda, trying to, remake the global economy as well in this fact, in this image, in this socialist characteristic. And this begins with a restructuring of the domestic system. So the digital yuan, aims to take this forward. Secondly, it is China aims to emerge as a leader in the central bank digital currency space. And this is very valid considering the impending great power tech competition that US and China are already entering into. So China's domestic vision sees the DCEP as part of its drive to digitalize and intelligentize its government, and that's a big phrase for China at the moment. So it's looking to really push forward its digital drive, not only with its private institutions, but also the economy and society at large. It's interesting that although I think Marc pointed this out as well, although Chinese officials have emphasized the eCNY's rollout as focused on domestic markets and domestic goals, there are definitely several indicators that Beijing sees the digital currency as a means to achieve its renminbi international goals as well. So, for instance, I mean, if you just look at the way that the eCNY has been rolled out, it's been done very strategically. In major financial and tech hubs, Shenzhen, the Greater Bay Area, Xiong'an area, these are all major financial and technological hubs, and the pattern that it is following, moving on to Hong Kong after these cities. This follows a parallel strategy to what China followed with its RMB internationalization when it first began looking in that direction. So China's at least one of its major underlying aims is really to promote a greater acceptance of the RMB as a global reserve currency. And with the US lagging behind in its crypto race, I mean, I don't know if it would be valid to call it a race anymore, because China is so far ahead compared to these other industrialized economies, especially the US. So as Stephen Ehrlich, who is the Forbes Director of Research for Digital Assets, put it, he said that China is all but waging a digital currency insurgency on the global financial system. It's not even a competition at this point. And China will have the first mover advantage, which will enable it to export its eCNY model, such as through its tie-ups with the central banks of Thailand, UAE, and Hong Kong, which I think came about earlier this year. And China will, have the advantage of writing the rules of the game in the international arena. So these plans have some serious implications that we must consider. China has really vied for dominance in the tech race and sought to promote a China model of techno-authoritarianism in global norms. And Beijing's dominance in the central bank digital currency sector would only serve to enhance Chinese influence over the global arrangements, global economic and political arrangements in this sector, in the CBDC sector. So China's shaping of cyberspace, of course, I mean, it is shaping the financial technology space, but also the cyberspace at large. And this shaping would hardly be in line with Western liberal democratic ideals, values like transparency, openness, that US, Europe, even Japan, Australia, and India, and the G7 economies promote. So China's standard setting could undermine human rights, especially the right to privacy. And as Chinese regulations would serve as sort of a diplomatic tool for Beijing to expand its reach and capabilities. Lastly, I would like to highlight that there is still a lot of uncertainty about how the eCNY will integrate with the existing private payment systems in China's domestic markets. There has been, a lot of conflicting information, different statements by different officials, which only throw more confusion about how it will take shape. And the technical structure of the DCEP system is still not known, and the legal questions of data privacy and policy still remain unanswered. In the two-tier structure that Marc talked about in his paper, there is still little clarity about what the true role of the People's Bank of China will be. So compared to the commercial banks which form the second tier. So we're not sure, how much control the PBOC will really have. And but at this point, I guess we have to assume that they would have access to all financial data. They would have access to all the troves of information that that commercial banks process. In terms of the technical structure, some reports have suggested that the DCEP would be blockchain based with extensive central bank control, while other reports suggest that PBOC is moving away entirely from blockchain because of as its underlying technology, because of questions about the technology's ability to handle massive troves of data for a nationwide rollout of the currency. But because Beijing sees the digital currency as a matter of national security and vulnerable to cybersecurity attacks, certain elements of the system will likely always be highly guarded state secrets, and we might never have full access to how the system actually works, even once it's rolled out. And this lack of transparency could be deeply problematic in both the domestic and international settings. In the domestic sense, for instance, the DCEP actually complements China's the CCP's strategy for technology-driven governance, and aims to expand its digital authoritarianism. I mean, China has about 900 million internet users, and 86% of these actively use Alipay or WeChat Pay, which belong to tech giants Alibaba and Tencent, to carry out transactions. So this amounts to roughly $50 trillion per year. And the PBOC will likely have direct access to transaction data of all these users. So this is so significant. I mean, it will be able to access financial data of almost, that is 800 million users in China. And this essentially, transforms the system from merely being a digital currency to, a big data set in a way. And, it gives the Chinese government a data set that can be employed for various other purposes. The government will have unparalleled access to real-time financial data enabling far-reaching oversight. And the DCEP will essentially become a surveillance tool or even a punitive tool of an authoritarian regime. Marc talked about the social credit system, and if the DCEP is integrated with the social credit system, this could be problematic for how it is used in the future. And I think this is something we need to be thinking about. How can, we need to be thinking about how the international community, Western powers can sort of respond to this and look at these implications. And this definitely requires a lot more study. I think I'll end with my comments now, and I do have a few questions, but I'll pass over to Larissa and I can address them later.
Thank you so much for commenting. It's very great to see that your discussion going on here. So I think there's a lot to unpack, and we're still not aware of what kind of shape the eCNY is going to take in the end. We already have a few questions, but before we move on to those, I would like to give you two the chance to comment on each other or discuss if you have anything, because Mahima, you said you have questions, so do feel free.
Okay, I'll just pose a few questions. First of all, for Marc, what do you believe are the primary challenges of China's eCNY program, in the short and long term? You of course talk about the possibility of competition from foreign central bank digital currencies, and most industrialized economies, they're still at the R&D phase, but they are collaborating, such as under the BIS, to accelerate this process and start experimenting and rolling out pilot programs. So this could be one challenge to the ECNY's ambitions. But what other challenges do you foresee? My second question is, do you think the 2022 rollout is a feasible goal? I mean, there's not a lot of time left, and yeah, I mean, the pilot program has been released, but Beijing is still quite a way far from a full rollout, even in the locations connected to the Beijing Olympics. So, do you think this is a feasible goal? Lastly, I wanted to bring up the concept of common prosperity, which is receiving a lot more attention in Xi Jinping's speeches and policies, and it has clearly become a strategic priority for the CCP. So how do you think this focus will connects to the eCNY? Yeah, I mean, the last question was, of course, how can Western countries counter the eCNY's potential as a surveillance coin? But yeah, I mean, that's a difficult one to answer.
Okay, thank you very much for your comments, and thank you for some excellent questions. I'll try to address them best I can. Talking about challenges to the eCNY, if I were to make a list, at the top of the list would be the question of trust. The problem is we are entering very, very new domains here. And it is going to be difficult. Like, we can talk about these, very successful examples of test runs, like very small, very controlled samples of very small amounts of eCurrency. That's one thing. But getting to the point where it becomes a standard, getting to the point where it becomes a day-to-day use in China and more to the point outside of China is quite a different story. The question of how it would be rolled out, especially internationally, is still not something which has been completely explained by the central government. There was even some suggestion, it came up in a few news stories late last year, that the eCNY might actually be introduced at a lower value than the actual physical renminbi in order to make it more attractive, in order to basically get a market started. So that would seem to suggest that a few of the kind of nuts and bolts still have to be worked out. And then there's the question of which countries would be willing to kind of experiment with this new technology. Now, certainly there has been discussions about, for example, Pakistan making use of eCNY through various projects related to the China-Pakistan economic corridor. There's also been the suggestion that Russia might make use of it, as well as potentially Ecuador or maybe some other countries that are willing to kind of move away from the dollar standard, if you will. But the problem is, getting that trust is not something that can be done very quickly. And even though, as you pointed out, there's a first mover advantage, what the United States has been saying, which may or may not be a good idea, is that, okay, maybe it's not the best idea to be first, because if there are any significant problems with the rollout, well, that trust is going to be very difficult to retain. Add the fact that we don't have a clear idea of the mechanisms behind the currency. And I would say trust is far and away the biggest issue, especially because we've seen multiple examples of the volatility of once you start to get a currency online. I mentioned El Salvador. Their rollout of Bitcoin, the Chivo wallet, was very erratic, to put it politely. And it resulted in, I think Bitcoin lost something like 17% drop there in its value very temporarily. As a result of the difficulties in El Salvador. So this is something which has to be done extremely carefully. And there's the question of whether all of the contingencies have been met. Now, talking about 2022, yes, I think that there are going to be quite a few challenges in making it fully used during the Olympics. And we don't know what the definition of fully used will be. Now, just over the past week, we've seen examples of trade fairs where, again, people can go kind of sample, buy coffee, buy small items, using the eCNY. I think it's very likely that we'll see examples of that at Olympic villages in Beijing, and that'll be considered, okay, this is a widespread rollout. But the pushback has already started to appear in certain areas. Some US lawmakers have already called upon athletes in Beijing to not use the currency because of its perceived security problems. There is going to be the question of, okay, to what degree we're going to be seeing like the definition of a successful rollout. And even Chinese officials have said this is not something that can be launched all at once. It will be a phased process, and there very likely will be some cases where, okay, we might need to go back and regroup. But the fact is China does have time on its side for now, because very few other large economies have gotten anywhere near close to what China has been able to do right now. And the other point is that China now sees a window of opportunity. The United States lost quite a bit of time where it could have been taking that opportunity to build its own model. So I think that the rollout process is going to be very slow, and I think there is going to be a kind of concentration on just making sure that everything is done right with, as few surprises as possible. Now, you talk about equality. This is very interesting because we've seen, again, just over the past few weeks, it's been incredible the amount of top-down changes that we're seeing to the tech industry, to the finance industry, to the education industry, all in the name of promoting greater equality. And it doesn't take much to see the eCNY kind of fitting into that, because one major point which the Chinese government has been stressing all the way through is that with the digital renminbi, everybody wins. Like, everybody gets to benefit from this. Those who have existing bank accounts will be able to conduct transactions that much faster. Transactions will be more secure. You don't have to worry about transnational crime or counterfeiting. If you do not have a bank account, well, that's great. You now have the opportunity to engage in financial transactions because this is a kind of non-banked type setup. And you have the ability eventually to make the CNY become a standard for global trade, to reduce the time necessary to move money around internationally, and to benefit Chinese businesses who are interested in going out. So you have a situation whereby, at least in theory, everybody is a winner with this process. And with that, there's also the concept of equality being more maintained. It's very interesting to see how the idea of growth, especially in the tech sector, is now being marginalized in favor of, okay, we want a more level playing field. So yes, I'll be very curious to see how the eCNY is going to be kind of brought into that equation and will become a part of this process.
Okay, thank you so much. Mahima, I hope that all of this answers your questions in a satisfactory manner. All right. I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. And we have one from Jerke Hellström, who was wondering to what extent are there misconceptions about the eCNY in media or in academia in China?
Yeah, thanks, Jerke. That's an excellent question. And I would say probably the first misperception or misconception that's being perpetuated by the media and some coverage of the eCNY is the fact that this is designed to be a direct challenge to the dollar. And I think that needs to be approached very carefully. Now, you do have a lot of frustration being expressed by US policymakers as well as the US media that the US dollar is now under challenge from a variety of different fronts. Again, to go back to El Salvador, there was a lot of critical articles in papers like the Wall Street Journal who have said that the only reason this is being done is to push back against the dollar, that this has nothing to do with domestic economic development. It's all about kind of pushing the United States financial power backwards. And I'm certainly not arguing that China is interested in getting some distance from the US dollar process. But I would be careful about treating this as strictly a challenge, a zero-sum competition with the US dollar, especially considering that the US dollar still has a massive advantage if you look at day-to-day global transactions. And that is not something that is going to be reversed overnight, especially going back to what I said about trust. It is going to take quite some time before China is able to put out this digital currency and have it be made internationally acceptable, let alone become a standard. And I should also point out that the coverage in the media has also kind of suggested that, okay, this is something which is going to be very, very fast moving and something which is probably going to be a standard very soon. And again, I don't agree that that timetable is feasible. So I think probably the biggest misconception is that this is almost primarily a zero-sum game. There is an aspect to that, but I think there's also the idea that China is treating this both in terms of a defensive prospect, but also as a way of bringing the Chinese economy to a different level in the financial world. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Mahima, would you like to add anything to this?
No, I think that actually covers it. I mean, that was the first thing I thought of as well. That is, Chinese media does tend to play it up as a direct challenge, or something which could challenge the dollar's dominance on the international stage, and it's simply not there yet. So yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with Marc here.
I think there's also a lot of discussion about this being a way to avoid international sanction regimes in many ways, but it seems that this is quite far-fetched, and it seems not there yet. So it's I agree with you. We have another question, which reads: to set global standards in e-currency, presumably China needs to engage other countries through key international organizations like the BIS, so the Bank of International Settlements, if I'm not mistaken. What kind of influence does China have in these organizations?
It's an excellent question. And I noted that China's already started to engage in exploratory talks with other governments like Thailand and the UAE to create some kind of synchronization of digital currencies. So we've already started to see some attempts, and I would also add Pakistan again to the list, to create some kind of network, some kind of general understanding as to how the digital currency process would work. Now, to what degree does China have influence? Well, that is a direct equation of what is the strength of the Belt and Road and what is the strength of China's economic power vis-a-vis another region or another country. And certainly in light of what we've seen with the trade war and what we've seen with the fact that there's a lot of questions about the post-pandemic economic recovery, we're seeing a lot of talk about hedging, a lot of talk about not being too dependent on any one particular economic actor. So I would say that China does have the ability to affect at least a lot of the dialogue about potential digital currency standard setting, especially if the initial rollout of the eCNY proves to be relatively successful. And especially if we're still waiting for a longer period of time for an equivalent, let's say, US or European standard.
Mahima, would you like to add anything? You're always free to just jump in.
Yeah, to bring up, I mean, decoupling, that has definitely emerged as a major theme here. And we could, question whether China's influence will reduce if this decoupling trend really intensifies or, succeeds. But I think there's a lot of, there are a lot of questions about how this decoupling will take place, because China is very well integrated into the international economy. And even, I mean, countries like India, for instance, we have a border dispute with China, and our ties are at probably their lowest point in 65 years or something. But still, decoupling from China entirely is not an option for India or the United States, for that matter, despite their competition. So while we may see partial decoupling, probably in the tech sector where there are cybersecurity concerns, an entire decoupling is not feasible, and I don't think it will significantly impact China's economic power. So even in the short-term, medium-term future, China will have quite a bit of influence. And if the eCNY rollout is successful, as Marc said, it will have the power to sort of shape the international standards in the domain.
Very true. I think there's a follow-up question that I see here. Do you see any way in which the US could block or delay the international rollout for eCNYs, for the eCNY, for example, by leaning on US allies to not cooperate with China on
Yeah, very good question. And I would say that it would be very difficult, just based on past experience. I think it would be very difficult for the United States to fully block the intended rollout of the eCNY. Now, it could encourage, as was pointed out, friends and allies to approach it with great caution. And I think that, yes, we will see a time lag of many countries looking at the situation very closely, trying to figure out, okay, how safe is this? How stable is this? Is it secure? And trying to get an idea of, okay, when you talk about privacy, what specifically we're talking about here. But the fact is, China is a major economic player, and it is extremely difficult to ignore either in the world of trade or in the world of finance. I go back to the example which was pointed out about, Mahima talked about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and I think that is a little bit of an interesting model to take note of. When the IIB first came out, the United States was again calling upon all of its friends and allies, don't go near it, don't engage it, it is too suspect. Very few countries outside of China's immediate neighbors did, New Zealand being one exception. It has a very independent foreign policy. But then all of a sudden, bolt from the blue, the UK decides to join up, then various European states, Canada, and all of a sudden, the AIB has a massive number of new members, with the United States still out of the system. So I think that is a cautionary tale that US influence, at least in terms of saying don't do this, is limited, especially if, again, the eCNY does turn out to be durable.
Yeah, and I can only add that, I mean, in the immediate future, rolling out the eCNY internationally is still, I mean, China's plans are limited in this context at present. It is looking at rolling out eCNY in cross-border transactions, but only with the BRI nations for now. So most of, Belt and Road Initiative nations are actually, a part of China's orbit, so to say, and they are more likely to be influenced by China than really listen to US's cautions about the currency. I mean, as it is not very likely that Pakistan will question the eCNY, and it will probably be more willing to adopt it once it becomes an option, as compared to to gain more financial advantages via the BRI as well. So yeah, I think the US influence is limited here.
Thank you both so much for elaborating on this. We do have two questions actually from Gerald Chen. So the first one is about 100 or so patents, or like China holds about 100 patents on the eCNY. How does this profit, or like how does this benefit China, and how does it affect China's hold on international standard setting in the field? And as a follow-up to this, on China writing the rules of the game, so to say, how would they do it ideally? How would they enforce compliance by others, or like how would they, like through what kind of mechanism would they try to get others to jump on board?
Okay, really good questions. Talking about patents and talking about the initial advantages that China would have in terms of, well, short-term profit, I would say that I think that China would probably benefit for the most part in just being able to create a relatively kind of stable playing field, if you will, in order to develop these technologies, in order to create a situation whereby it could pretty much roll out the currency successfully without necessarily having to run into outside pressures to create these patents in order to successfully do that. I don't see a great deal of possibility for short-term profit, but China's also made it very clear that it is willing to take the time, take the measures necessary in order to make sure that this experiment, and it is still very much an experiment, is very much successful. So I'm not sure the situation is about profit so much as to create breathing space, but happy to get others' opinion on this.
In the long term, though, I think that it could be beneficial. I mean, especially if the eCNY rollout is successful, and China starts collaborating with other states in trying to export its model and trying to, help other states develop a similar e-currency maybe. So, if something like that comes about, then maybe we could envision China having more control, more influence with its patents, but that's about it, yeah.
Interesting, thank you so much. We'd have another question from Johannes Nordin, who writes, in the last decade, Washington has been increasingly willing to abuse SWIFT's financial dominance and apply extraterritorial secondary sanctions, including on long-standing allies. For example, the JCPOA sanctions, Nord Stream, or India-Russia S-400 deals. Do you think that the DCEP's competition will push the US to use sanctions more sparingly, or will Washington instead try to double down on unilateralism?
Okay. First of all, I accidentally jumped over Gerald's second question. I also wanted to suggest the idea that China would potentially set up a mechanism. I think that is very much a long-term, like a very long-term aspect right now. How China would set the rules of the game, first of all, the priority is to get the currency up and running, get it accepted, and have it become mundane, have it become a standard. I think at that point, China would start to become much more interested in regime setup. I don't think that is a first priority right now. The fact is, China is very nervous about too much of a, if there was a considerable backlash against the process, even before the eCNY had a chance to fully roll out, that would not be optimal conditions. So I would definitely think that Beijing would want to go slow approach. Now, about the idea of making use of SWIFT as a pressure point, yes, that definitely opened a door which cannot very easily be closed again. There was always kind of the underlying view that, okay, that even though countries may have significant differences with each other, these kinds of financial systems were kind of off limits. And that kind of standard got challenged back in 2012 when Iranian banks were delisted. This was something which was also attempted under the Trump administration. And China took very careful note of this, both in regards to Iran, as well as the suggestion that maybe Russia should be pushed off SWIFT as well. And I think that that definitely caused China to accelerate its process. And I think it also sent a message to the United States that if you are going to do this, you are going to risk blowback of various types. You are going to risk having countries really concentrate on setting up shelter from that kind of pressure. Now, I don't know if this is going to result, I think it's still a bit too early in the Biden administration to suggest that, okay, maybe the United States will be less willing to reach for that particular lever. But, as we see the situation between the US and China, continuing to be extremely difficult on multiple fronts, I think it will be very tempting for the Biden government to continue to use financial pressure, especially if it looks like China will be able to get the eCNY out sooner rather than later. So I'm not optimistic that we'll see a cooling down. I'm hoping I'm wrong, but I'm just not seeing it. Thanks.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, in the short term, it is really difficult to see US move away from its strategy of using sanctions to sort of influence behavior of its adversaries. It has used sanctions. I don't know whether successfully or unsuccessfully, but it has used them against various regimes. And under the Biden administration, I don't think this is very likely to change. Although I do think that increasingly we could see the US looking for more joint sanctions by like-minded powers or via international bodies as compared to unilateral sanctions, which tend to not be received well. So we could see the US trying to collaborate with its like-minded powers, maybe Australia, Japan, the Quad countries, or the European Union especially, and collaborate when it comes to imposing such sanctions rather than imposing unilateral ones. But yeah, I mean, that has been a part of its strategy for long as well. So maybe just a bit more focus here, but not much change.
Right. Okay. So we covered the topic of international relations very much today. I would like to draw attention to like more domestic implications for the remainder of the time. So there's been a lot of talk about surveillance capabilities being increased for the Chinese government and this being linked to the social credit system. I was hoping that you could both maybe elaborate a bit on what we might see. How would this pan out for China's population when this is finally rolled out on maybe a larger scale?
Yes. Sorry, thanks. Good question. I would first of all say that what China has been trying to stress in the rollout of the eCNY is that this is basically a three-tier process. At the bottom, you have the individual consumer, the individual user of the technology, going through their day-to-day purchasing. Next level up, you have the commercial banks, which will be kind of the point of contact for the distribution of the currency. And then at the top, you have the People's Bank of China, which is the Chinese central bank and what is obviously directly connected to the party state. So it is that configuration and it's the specific abilities of the PBOC, which is causing the most amount of concern, both about privacy and about oversight. Now, the social credit system has been, again, experimented on over the past few years, and there's been attempts both by the Chinese government and the Chinese media, again, to paint it as a situation whereby everybody wins. That if you pay your bills on time, if you are a responsible consumer, etc., you will get benefits, you will have the ability to purchase train tickets, flights, and so forth. So it's a very interesting form of social modeling. One which, unfortunately, not only opens the door to questions about privacy, but with the eCNY, with the amount of transactions which have the ability to be tracked by the Chinese central government, that is where things get a bit complicated in terms of what are the benefits to the Chinese consumer in regards to what kind of privacy will need to be given up in order to use this service. Because it has been suggested that eventually the paper currency, the kind of regular standard Yuan, will be phased out. And the eCNY will be the only way of conducting any kind of day-to-day transactions. So there are a lot of very serious questions which will need to be answered here in terms of what exactly are the risks in regards to both privacy and the relationship with the social credit system.
Yeah, I don't have much to add here. I mean, as you said, it's the DCEP's integration with the social credit system is definitely a major point of concern. The international community has already seen, you know, how the social credit system has been applied in Xinjiang, and China's just track record of human rights. You know, it makes the use of DCEP in this, you know, in this context as a surveillance tool, very worrying. I mean, moving forward, we could also see, you know, China looking at artificial intelligence solutions and looking to build these into an overall, you know, surveillance apparatus. So the future projection could be yeah, terrifying in some aspects, but I think it remains to be seen how it will actually take shape, because this is all speculation at this point, based on you know, based on the limited information available and based on China's previous record. But how it actually takes shape remains to be seen.
Yeah, I guess it's too early to really say what's going to happen, but they brought up this term of controllable anonymity. Any thoughts on this? Or...
Yeah, good question. I would also add to Mahima's point, we already had another model that was used extensively in regards to kind of social oversight. During the pandemic, people in China were issued with red, yellow, green, basically phone apps, if you will, which allowed for entrance into particular buildings, facilities, and so forth. And again, that allowed for a great deal of information to be collected during this period. So again, we have another model which could be potentially worked with. Let me see. In regards to, okay, Mahima, did you want to add to that?
Well, I just to add to, I mean, the phone app, that is one system which could be integrated with this overall surveillance architecture. But also, surveillance cameras, CCTV cameras, which China has used, and there is speculation about how they may be combined with facial recognition programs to create an additional database and to integrate all this under under China's Integrated Joint Operations Platform, IJOP. So there are talks about that. Of course, again, this is speculation, and this is not something official sources have said that they're looking at. But there is this worry that the DCEP will be integrated into a larger surveillance structure. It would be interesting to see how this plays out.
All right, one more question. What about we talk about this being a very omnipresent thing, and that it's not going to break down, but you need some kind of digital infrastructure for all of this to work. And I'm wondering what the government is planning to do. Are there any plans to like widen the scope of internet access in this regard, or is there more of a cluster in like bigger cities, or how should we see the rollout of like the digital infrastructure going hand in hand with the rollout of the eCNY? And I'm also wondering what the impact of climate change on this might be, because we might see a breakdown of systems. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, excellent questions. Regarding the rollout process, like we've definitely seen, as Mahima pointed out, a focus on kind of technology-friendly parts of the country, especially in cities, those that are used to various types of technology, those that, cities where you see Alipay and WeChat Pay and various forms of mobile payment already become ubiquitous. So the kind of switch over to the eCNY has been, in many cases, a very kind of straightforward process. The bigger question will be how to move it outside of the cities, how to basically put it forward to people who have less access to digital finance, to people who do not have bank accounts, to people who do not engage in banking that regularly. That is going to be the challenge there. There's going to be a great need for education. There's going to be a great need for developing understanding of the process, making it more widespread within the country. And we go back to the question of whether the infrastructure will handle it, because going back to the question of whether this will be a blockchain-based process, originally the eCNY was supposed to be based entirely on the blockchain framework. Now we're starting to see, well, maybe blockchain is not going to be sufficient to deal with these kinds of numbers and these kinds of transactions. So there's talk about blockchain plus. And now there's the issue of, well, okay, what additional technology are we talking about? And we don't really know. There hasn't been a great deal of discussion. We are seeing various policy papers come out from the Chinese government. We've started to see some academic papers come out on the subject. But the underlying question is, what is the actual framework of this going to be? Still has yet to be answered. Then you talk about climate change. Well, yes, this is something which has to be looked at very carefully. Now, one of the reasons, and we can debate whether this was the real reason, as to why China clamped down very hard on Bitcoin mining earlier this year, was the environmental impact, as well as the strain on the power grid in many parts of the country. So there's going to be a bit of a question of, okay, if we're going to start to see a large number of transactions move online over the next 5, 10, 20 years, how is that going to affect not only energy security in China, but also its environmental situation? And again, those are questions which we have not really heard a lot about. And I'm very curious to see the answers to that.
Mahima, would you like to add anything?
I think that was exactly what I would have answered. So I'm going to refrain from adding much here. But yeah, I really agree with you. Whether the domestic digital infrastructure can handle it will will remain a question. But maybe under a focus on common prosperity, there might be, there have been some policies which are looking to sort of enhance the income levels and sort of even things out between the gap between the rich and the poor. So maybe within this broader focus on common prosperity, we may see a focus on building digital infrastructure in the inlands, which are relatively lesser developed. So China could, this could be a next step in the process for the eCNY's nationwide rollout. And talking about climate change, yes, I mean, yeah, the crackdown on Bitcoin was framed as cracking down on pollution, and pollution was cited as one of the major climate change concerns were cited. But I don't know how much of that is actually true, or how much of the crackdown was really influenced by climate change concerns. So yeah, I think it would be interesting to see how China handles the climate change question moving forward.
For sure, yeah. One point that Marc just brought up is the tech giants, and we saw the disappearance of Jack Ma earlier this year. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on the relationship going forward between the Chinese government and those tech giants, being the providers of the means to handle the eCNY? So any thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and that goes back to your question about perceptions of privacy. Now, on one hand, yes, this has been stressed up and down by the Chinese government that any user of digital currency has reasonable expectations of privacy. But you look at what's been happening over the past few weeks, you look at a considerable crackdown on not only technology industries, that's been going on for quite some time, but also now we're starting to see directives against idols and celebrities. We're starting to see calls for people to play less video games per week. We're starting to see some significant changes to the centralization of education up and down. So how to reconcile that with the idea that no, the central government will step back and not monitor your purchases, it's getting a little bit more difficult to reconcile. And what has been happening to China's tech industries has just been fascinating, both in terms of the speed and the effects that we're starting to notice. Like, again, just in the news this week, people are saying, well, why would anyone invest in China's tech companies under current circumstances? We're seeing forcible breakups, fines, issues of antitrust, anti-monopoly. And I wonder whether at least part of this is, especially in the case of, let's say, Alibaba and Tencent, in order to remove them as potential obstacles to the successful rollout of the eCNY. Because any kind of successful digital currency will in some ways minimize the strength of Alipay and WeChat Pay, as well as various other kind of tech industries. So this is why I talked before about whether this is an exercise in kind of clearing the decks in order to make sure that there are no potential centers of power to prevent this kind of very successful rollout. And it definitely suggests, though, that for all the talk about China wanting to become a tech powerhouse, there are very, very significant red lines which are being drawn right now. And what Beijing is saying is that at the end of the day, we are going to be the ones who are going to be setting the agenda.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, Beijing is trying to sort of shift from its previous focus. If you go back in history, after Mao's policies, which prioritize socialism over growth, we had Deng Xiaoping come in and really say that the aim should be to grow first, to open his open door policy. Basically, economic growth was prioritized over development in some ways, and development would follow. That was the idea. And with Xi Jinping, we are sort of seeing a shift away from this again. I mean, economic growth has become secondary to socialism and equality, such values under common prosperity. So I mean, if you look at how the Chinese companies are responding to it, there has been a sudden and massive uptick in tech giants and donating huge amounts of money to this common prosperity drive, and they are really trying to come under Beijing's good graces to avoid future scrutiny by the government. So there is this fear, and this will definitely impact the tech industry moving forward. And you see a lot of examples about how China is disregarding privacy here as well. I mean, with the rule on ban on video games for children, Tencent has actually rolled out a technology which will a facial scan basically, so that they can monitor no child plays more than the allotted time during the week, and they do not use someone else's ID passwords to access video games. So there is this pandering up to the government and sort of not prioritizing, not looking at growth, but looking at the government policies here. And when it comes to the CBDC, as Marc said, this could be a case of clearing the deck, but we don't know how it will be structured. I mean, we're still not sure whether this will be a competitor to Alibaba Pay or Alipay or WeChat Pay, or whether this will integrate with them, as whether these platforms will be sort of another level to the eCNY wallet. And we're still not sure exactly how the structure will work. So there are questions about that, but it could definitely be a question of clearing the deck and paving the way for the digital yuan.
Okay, thank you so much. We're gonna wrap up here. I think there's a lot more to talk about, but as both of you already mentioned, there are lots of questions that we cannot answer at this point because it's much more speculation than anything else. So I would like to thank both of you for a very interesting discussion, for presenting your ideas, and I hope that we can have a follow-up on this when there's more coming out, and maybe once the Beijing 2022 Olympics have started and we've seen how it's actually rolled out. So thank you so much, both of you, and for our audience for posing very interesting questions, very thought-provoking questions. So have a good day, everyone, and thank you for tuning in.
Thank you, everyone.